There are disasters the world remembers, and there are disasters so enormous, so politically poisonous, that governments choose a different solution. They erase them. But here is the paradox. In 2024, a team of Cold War researchers analyzing old Soviet tapes noticed signals the original engineers never recorded. Something had been left behind, unnoticed for decades. If a base collapses in the deepest corner of Siberia, leaves no survivors, no paperwork, no graves, no orders, no maps, then why does its signal still appear on Cold War-era monitoring tapes, 30 years after the base itself was physically destroyed? Today, we open the forgotten files of a disaster the Soviet Union claimed never happened. The collapse of Kolos Station, a covert Siberian outpost buried under ice, secrecy, and decades of political fear. It should have disappeared. It should have been lost with the empire that built it. But something inside that base refused to remain silent. And that is where the story begins. The base that shouldn't exist officially, the Soviet Union never constructed permanent military installations beyond the Yenisei perimeter in 1952. Unofficially, satellite captures tell a different story. Hidden under 80 feet of permafrost lies a grid pattern too precise, too symmetrical, too engineered to be natural. Right in the dead center of this frozen nothingness sits the faint outline of what analysts call Object S14. No one knows what the S stands for, but those who worked on it prefer the older code name, Kolos. The ear, a listening post, a secret one, a base designed to hear things even Moscow couldn't publicly acknowledge. Not just foreign radio traffic, not just American nuclear tests, something else, something buried deep. Modern investigators combing through archived recordings found traces of a transmission, indecipherable, yet unmistakably real. The Soviets either missed it or chose to ignore it. The first unexplained signal. The earliest surviving document connected to Kolos Station is a torn, half-charred page, recovered from a Soviet archive years after the collapse of the USSR. It reads only 2 lines. Transmission detected from below Sector 7. Not human. No date, no unit signature, no explanation, just those words. And yet, that fragment was enough to ignite the curiosity of Cold War historians decades later. If Kolos was only a listening station, why was it hearing things underground? What was underneath it? What was powerful enough to trigger seismic microphones and military-grade radio sensors? These were questions nobody dared ask at the time. Because for Kolos Station, questions were dangerous. The men who never returned. In November 1957, a convoy of 14 specialists left Krasnoyarsk under the cover of a supply mission. Only 11 arrived at Kolos Station. The official report blamed severe winter conditions. But weather logs show unbroken clear skies on that entire route. 3 men vanished. No bodies, no wreckage, no tire tracks beyond the final checkpoint. It was as if the Siberian wilderness swallowed them whole. Among recovered belongings was Officer Leonid Markov's diary, its last entry describing shadows moving beneath the snow, something watching them silently. They said that the missing men weren't taken by cold. They disappeared after reporting movement beneath the snow, as if something was following the convoy from underground. But the commandant of Kolos Station ordered silence. The men signed secrecy papers, and the incident was buried deeper than the base itself. The purpose of Kolos. It wasn't just a listening post. It wasn't just a radar station. And it certainly wasn't simply another Soviet bunker in the middle of nowhere. Its real function lay beneath it, in a structure built long before the Cold War ever began. Archaeologists would later discover faint indications that the region held an unrecorded pre-Siberian culture, thousands of years old. But in the 1950s, nobody knew that, except the Soviet scientists assigned to Kolos. They were aware of something below the ice, something the indigenous tribes spoke about only in whispers. They called it Kirin Yal, the place that speaks. Locals refused to go near it for generations. Dogs refused to cross its perimeter. Compasses behaved strangely. The ground hummed at night. Perfect conditions for a Cold War military installation. The day the humming stopped, Soviet diaries recovered years later reveal something unnerving. On December 3rd, 1958, the humming beneath Kolos Station suddenly stopped. Not faded, not weakened, stopped. That might sound like good news, but the base logs tell a different story. The moment the humming ceased, 3 events occurred simultaneously. 1. Every radio in the base lost contact with Moscow. 2. The geothermal sensors began recording rapid temperature drops in the lower levels, far below what was possible naturally. 3. And most concerning of all, a new sound began. A low, rhythmic pulse, mechanical, deliberate, like something switching on after decades of being dormant. One officer wrote in his journal, "For the first time, I felt like the ice was breathing." The hidden levels. Kolos Station officially had 3 floors. Unofficially, it had 6. The bottom 3 levels were accessible only to red-level personnel. Military historians estimate fewer than 22 people in the entire Soviet Union had clearance to enter level 5 or 6. Those levels housed the Aurelia arrays, classified devices designed to detect subglacial vibrations and convert them into electromagnetic readings. No documentation explains what the arrays were originally built to detect, but an engineer who escaped Russia in the late 1990s left a chilling hint. They weren't listening for Americans. They were listening for something ancient. The first collapse. On January 9, 1959, a tremor hit Kolos Station. Siberia is seismically quiet. The region had no history of tectonic movement. Yet instruments detected a deep, long rumble that lasted 26 seconds. The ceiling lights flickered. Fuel tanks rattled. Pipes shook like bones in a trembling hand. Level 6, the lowest and most restricted floor, suffered catastrophic structural buckling. 3 corridors caved in. 4 scientists working below were trapped instantly. Rescue teams attempted to descend, but radiation meters spiked without any nuclear material present. The steel doors to Sector 6B fused shut, as if something inside was pushing outward. One of the rescuers described hearing a metallic scraping, like something shifting against the doors. But that report was redacted, and what happened next was sealed for decades. The message that shouldn't exist. Markov scribbled hastily. The ground shakes. The walls groan. I fear we are no longer masters of this place. If anyone reads this, beware what lies below. While Level 6 collapsed, a new signal appeared on the base's recording equipment. Not from foreign radio, not from seismic interference, from directly beneath Kolos Station. A voice. Speaking in patterns, non-linguistic, rhythmic, almost coded. The audio fragment was only 4 seconds long, but it was enough to terrify the operators. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound mechanical either. It sounded old, ancient, deep, like something speaking through layers of earth. The signal repeated once, twice, 3 times, each time slightly clearer. Then the entire base lost power, and for a moment, everyone inside Kolos Station heard the same thing. Not through instruments, not through speakers, through the ground. A long, resonant exhale, as if something beneath the base was waking up. The issued order. The Kremlin's response arrived 43 minutes after the blackout. A single command. Seal levels 4 to 6. Prepare for immediate evacuation. But the order was too late. The temperature around the base plummeted. Walls began to crack from the inside. Pipes burst. Doors warped. Something under the ice was shifting. Kolos Station was no longer a listening post. It was becoming a tomb. For the men stationed inside, this was the beginning of the disaster. For the world, it was the beginning of a secret. For the Soviet Union, it was a mistake they would bury at any cost. If a disaster destroys every witness, every document, every trace of its existence, does the disaster still exist? And if it truly never happened, why does its signal still echo beneath the Siberian ice, decades after the base that created it was wiped from history? The Soviet Union erased the Kolos Station disaster from every archive, every map, every official memory. But, paradoxically, the more they buried it, the louder its ghost began to speak. Today, we enter the Cold War's most forbidden chapter. The collapse of a base that should never have existed, in a place no human was ever meant to build in, above something no empire wanted to wake. The base that vanished from history official Soviet records list no facility east of the Yenisei perimeter in 1952. Yet Cold War-era U.S. satellite imagery shows a perfect geometric shadow beneath the snow, a shape too precise to be accidental. Analysts today call it Object S14, but its real name, known only to the men who served there, was Kolos Station. Kolos meant the ear, not because it listened to American transmissions, not because it monitored NATO aircraft. It listened to something the Soviet Union found beneath the ice, something older than the Cold War, something older than Russia, something alive. The first impossible signal. The earliest surviving scrap of paper linked to Kolos Station was found in a burned archive box in the late 1990s. A single sentence. Transmission from below Sector 7. Pattern not human. No signature, no timestamp, no chain of command. Just that. Researchers later confirmed the handwriting matched a physicist assigned to Kolos Station, one who disappeared during a weather accident, according to Soviet files. Except there was no storm recorded that day. No wind, no snow. Only a tremor beneath the ice. The convoy that never arrived in November 1957, a convoy of 14 personnel, departed Krasnoyarsk for Kolos Station. 11 arrived. The other 3. The official explanation was frostbite and exposure. But the convoy logs, unredacted versions recovered after the fall of the USSR, say something different. Visual disturbance beneath the snow. Men reported movement. Investigation aborted. 3 missing. Movement beneath the snow. No cave system existed in that region. No major predators. No seismic instability. So what was moving? A survivor, interviewed months before his death in 2006, whispered only this: it followed us. Not above, not around. Below. The true purpose of Kolos. The Soviets didn't build Kolos for military expansion. They built it to study something. To monitor a region the Evenki tribes refused to enter. Locals called the place Kirin Yal. The place that speaks. Elder testimonies, recorded secretly by ethnographers, described ground vibrations, unnatural humming at night, sudden drops in temperature, lights beneath the ice, animals refusing to cross the land. The Soviets assumed superstition. But then the humming began. For months, it was faint. A soft, rhythmic pulse felt through boots, floors, and metal structures. Then, on December 3rd, 1958, the humming stopped entirely. Every logbook described the same reaction. Silence, worse than noise. When the silence broke. The moment the humming ceased, 3 events were recorded at Kolos Station. 1. All long-range radios died instantly. Not jammed, not damaged, just dead, like someone cut reality itself instead of wires. 2. The temperature on levels 5 and 6 dropped to 73 degrees in minutes, far colder than the surface. Impossible without an active energy drain. 3. A second sound began underground, not humming, not mechanical, something slower, something deliberate, something breathing. A lieutenant later wrote, "It felt like we had woken something that should have stayed sleeping." The forbidden levels. Kolos Station officially had 3 levels. Unofficially, it had 6. Only red-level scientists entered the lower floors. Even senior officers were barred. These hidden levels contained the Aurelia arrays, devices designed to translate deep Earth vibrations into electromagnetic patterns. But the devices were not Soviet inventions. They were based on pre-existing schematics, recovered from an archaeological dig the USSR never acknowledged. No historian has ever identified who created the original designs. But the engineer who defected in 1998 claimed, "The arrays were not meant to listen to nature. They were meant to listen to something unnatural." The collapse begins on January 9th, 1959. At 0412 hours, the base shook violently, not from above, not from a storm, from below. A 26-second tremor buckled the supports under level 6. 3 corridors caved in. 4 scientists were trapped instantly. Rescue teams attempted to descend, but radiation detectors spiked. There was no nuclear material present. Yet the levels emitted readings equivalent to a reactor breach. One rescuer reported hearing metal being dragged, and something behind it. The report was blacked out entirely in the archives, but a carbon copy survived. The unnatural message. Right as level 6 collapsed, something else happened. A signal, the clearest ever recorded at Kolos, appeared across every array at once. A voice, not speaking any known language, not random noise, not coded numbers, a pattern, structured, intentional, almost like speech, slowed by centuries of distance. Operators who heard the playback described it as a warning or a response. The signal looped 3 times. Then the base went pitch black. And in that darkness, every man felt the same sensation. A long, dragging exhale, vibrating through the ground. Not human, not mechanical. Something older. Something waking up. The order that came too late. 43 minutes after the blackout, a message arrived from Moscow. Seal levels 4 to 6. Prepare evacuation. Do not investigate further. Why seal the levels? Why forbid investigation? Why evacuate a base that cost billions of rubles to build? No one knew. But before the evacuation even started, the ice beneath Kolos shifted again, louder, closer, angrier. The base wasn't collapsing naturally. It was being pushed from below, and the men inside felt it rising. A final tremor hit the station, short, violent, unlike anything before. Lights flickered, metal screamed, and from the deepest floor of the collapsed level 6, a second exhale rose through the concrete, closer, clearer, almost aware. Something beneath Kolos Station had just opened its eyes. If the Soviets were only listening, what exactly were they expecting to hear beneath the Siberian ice? How do you fight something you cannot see, but that can see you? How do you battle an enemy that leaves no footprints, no shadows, no body, yet bends steel, drains heat, and moves beneath the ground like it owns the earth itself? And if Kolos Station was built to control it, why did the station itself seem terrified of what lived below? The paradox of Kolos is simple. The more the Soviets fortified the base, the more fragile it became. The more sensors they added, the more the ice trembled. And the more they listened, the more it whispered back. Part 3 begins on the day the Soviets tried to contain the impossible. and discovered the impossible was studying them in return. The breathing Earth. The tremor that shattered Level 6 did more than crack concrete. It changed the pulse of the entire region. Engineers monitoring the Aurelia arrays noticed a shift. Not random noise, not natural seismic rhythm. A pattern, a beat, almost like a heart. Every 43 seconds, the ground beneath Kolos rose by exactly 2.3 millimeters, then fell again. That should be impossible. Ice sheets don't breathe. Rock doesn't expand and contract in perfect intervals, unless something was pushing from inside the Earth, then releasing. One operator wrote, "It feels like the land is alive." He was dismissed as hysterical. His supervisors laughed. By midnight, no one was laughing. Because at 0:03 hours, for the first time in Soviet history, the ice exhaled warm air. The sound no human should hear. 3 guards standing at the southern post reported hearing something beneath their boots. A low, dragging resonance that vibrated through bone instead of ears. Not metal, not machinery, not wind. It sounded like a phrase. A sound shaped intentionally, like speech. But not for human throats. One guard panicked and fired his rifle into the ice. The bullet disappeared into a crack with no echo. All 3 guards were detained for hallucinations. But deep inside Level 4, the Aurelia arrays were already recording the same phenomenon. Not a voice, not noise, something between the two. A message, a pattern that repeated across 4 separate sensors. Scientists didn't dare translate it, but the lead technician whispered only, "It's responding to us." The secret folder marked only Red Moth. During a frantic meeting in the command room, Colonel Vostrikov unlocked a metal case no one had ever seen before. Inside were documents stamped Krasny Babochka, Red Moth. These files were not part of the Kolos project. They predated it. According to the documents, the Soviets had detected similar underground signals once before, in 1937, during a failed mining operation. That mine collapsed. All 42 workers were listed as presumed dead. The signals stopped for exactly 22 years, until Kolos was built. Every scientist in the room realized the same thing. The station didn't cause the awakening. The station was built on top of the awakening. The ice wall that didn't hold. After the Level 6 collapse, engineers sealed the lower floors with 12-centimeter steel plates, reinforced beams, and nitrogen insulation. They believed nothing could break through from below. They were wrong. At 02:41 hours, sensors detected a temperature spike behind the steel wall. Not cold, but heat. Heat rising from beneath 300 meters of frozen earth. Impossible. Then the steel began to bend inward, slowly, deliberately. A perfect convex bulge. Something was pushing, not breaking the wall, not smashing through, but testing it, feeling its resistance, like a finger pressing against skin. A captured recording from the nearest microphone picked up a sound no one could explain. A slow, deliberate scrape, like claws tracing the inside of a cage. The scientists panicked. The commander froze. And then the wall tapped. Once, as if acknowledging their presence. The decision they never got to make panic surged through the station. Officers argued. Scientists screamed about evacuation. Radio operators tried to reach Moscow, but the lines hissed with static that seemed almost rhythmic. Then the tremors stopped. The warmth faded. The steel bulge relaxed back into its original shape. Silence returned. But it wasn't real silence. It was the silence of a predator watching and waiting. The men of Kolos didn't know it yet, but the thing beneath them had learned something new. The walls could bend. The humans were afraid, and the base was vulnerable. They had just failed the first test. The ground opens. At 03:19 hours, a rupture tore through Corridor 14, a long, narrow passage that separated the engineering wing from the medical bay. The rupture began with a hairline crack. Then, without warning, the floor split open. Not from above, not from structural failure, from something pulling downward. The entire corridor dipped, twisted, and snapped like wet wood. 2 soldiers vanished instantly, dragged into darkness so quickly their helmets didn't even fall. The remaining men fled. But before they reached safety, the corridor behind them began to rise, as if something beneath the earth had pushed it back into shape. The ground healed. The station walls reformed around a new geometry. No natural force does that. No geological event rearranges architecture like clay. Something was shaping the base from underneath, like a sculptor with infinite patience. Colonel Vostrikov stared at the resealed corridor for nearly a minute before whispering, "It's learning the layout." Decades later, modern scientists revisiting the site with satellite imagery and recovered sensor data concluded the base had never fully succumbed to the collapse. Something underground had survived, and it was learning. The Countermeasure Project. With communications failing, panic rising, and the base slowly rearranging itself, the Soviet engineers proposed a desperate plan. Trigger a surface-level detonation to collapse the land above level 6 and bury whatever was beneath. It was crude, dangerous, potentially suicidal, but it was the only option. The explosives were prepared. Detonation codes were primed. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3. But before they could trigger the blast, every light in the base went dark. And in the pitch-black silence, the ice beneath Kolos shifted again, not violently, not erratically, but with purpose. The tremor was slow, measured, almost thoughtful. Engineers described it like this. It wasn't an attack. It was a reply. The base starts to fail. Emergency lights flickered on, but they weren't red, they weren't white, they were blue, a color not used anywhere in Soviet emergency systems. The wiring had been altered, not by humans. The corridors now hummed faintly with electricity, even though the generators were offline. Metal plates along the floor vibrated in a strange sync, as if something underground was sending pulses upward. One scientist checked the Aurelia sensors. They were recording a new pattern, a deliberate one, not breathing, not exhaling, a signal, a repeating signal. The scientists stared at it in shock. The pattern looked familiar, a human heartbeat, except slower, deeper, older, every 43 seconds. Exactly. The same interval recorded before the collapse. The underground presence wasn't reacting. It was communicating. The message no one wanted to hear. Translator equipment wasn't meant for this. The arrays weren't built to decode something that lived beneath the earth. But as the signal repeated, scientists noticed variations, slight distortions, like syllables forming. Every repetition became more structured, more intentional, more intelligent. After nearly 20 loops, the lead technician whispered, "It's learning our translation system." The signal paused. A full 90 seconds of silence. Then a new frequency appeared, a deeper tone, a vibration that rattled the teeth of every man in the room. And through that vibration, through a sound that wasn't a sound, a shape formed. A pattern, a symbol, a message. Something simple, something chilling. Open. No one wanted to believe it, but the ice beneath Kolos groaned in agreement. A sudden snap echoed from the lower levels. Not a tremor, not a collapse, a deliberate break. A massive void opened beneath level 4, Air rushed downward, lights flickered, and the entire station tilted 2 degrees to the south. And from the new darkness below, something began climbing upward. Slow, steady, inevitable. If the thing beneath Kolos Station could learn Soviet signals in minutes, what else could it learn? And how much time did the Soviets really have left? How does a base designed to survive the end of the world fail because of something no one could detect, even when it was happening just meters beneath their feet? It's strange how catastrophes begin. People imagine explosions, alarms, screaming officers sprinting through corridors. But inside the Siberian installation, the disaster began in absolute silence. Not a tremor, not a sound, not even a flicker of light to warn them that the ground beneath their reinforced bunkers had already shifted by several centimeters. And by the time anyone realized the scale of what was happening, it was already too late. The Siberian base wasn't simply a bunker. It was a system, an ecosystem of steel, coolant tunnels, permafrost stabilizers, and long-range detection instruments that all depended on the ground staying still. But Siberia was never still. Beneath the ice sat an ancient geological fault line the Soviets thought they had mapped. They calculated it would remain dormant for another 10,000 years. Their math was wrong. It started with a single flicker on a monitoring panel inside sublevel 3. A faint blip, a vibration outside the expected range. Senior technician Yelena Tarasova leaned closer, adjusting her headset. She tapped the screen, then checked the analog gauge next to it. A discrepancy. Small but impossible to explain. The system didn't usually glitch. She glanced at the grimy clock mounted above her workstation. 02:14 a.m. Night shift. The quietest hours, when the cold outside froze the metal doors, and even the ventilation pipes hummed with a slower rhythm. She logged the anomaly and sent a routine flag to the operations room. But the vibration didn't stop. It grew, barely perceptible, barely measurable. Yelena stood up. Something deep within her instincts, something beyond training, told her this wasn't a system fault. This was structural. Below them, the earth was moaning. The pipes near her head let out a soft groan. Then another. She reached for her radio. Static answered her. At that same moment, Captain Rostov, asleep in his quarters, woke to a metallic thud. He sat up, heart hammering. The room was still, too still. He placed his feet on the cold concrete floor, listening. The air seemed heavy, almost pressurized, as if the entire base were holding its breath. A second sound came, a deep, shifting grind from somewhere miles below. Rostov grabbed his coat and sprinted down the corridor. He wasn't the only one. Doors opened all along the hallway. Faces emerged. Confused, half-awake soldiers rubbing their eyes, engineers holding clipboards, communications officers clutching radios that now emitted only static. No alarms had been triggered, but the base itself was beginning to groan, like a metal beast awakening from an uncomfortable sleep. Rostov burst into operations. Maps and schematics covered the walls. The overhead lights flickered as though something were draining power. "What's happening?" he demanded. Lieutenant Orlov pointed at the seismic panel. "We're getting micro-tremors," he said. "Not local, but building. They're symmetrical." "Symmetrical?" Rostov frowned. "Earthquakes don't become symmetrical." "That's what I'm saying. It looks artificial." "Artificial?" The word hung heavy in the air. Yelena entered moments later, her face pale. "Sub-level 3 is reporting coolant pressure drops," she said. 3 separate sectors. Rostov stiffened. The coolant systems didn't just regulate temperature. They stabilized the permafrost around the underground chambers. Without them, the ice would melt. And if the ice melted, parts of the structure could shift, collapse, or worse, rupture the hidden chambers that housed classified equipment. Rostov grabbed the intercom and shouted orders. Teams rushed into the tunnels. Engineers strapped on insulated gear. Soldiers grabbed lanterns and rifles, not because they expected a threat, but because every Soviet operation defaulted to control through force. Inside Tunnel 4, the air felt wrong. Warm, too warm. One of the coolant pipelines ran overhead, massive steel tubing 1/2 meter thick. Frost usually coated it like white moss. Instead, condensation dripped from it. Drops of water hit the floor and rolled toward a small drainage line. But then one droplet changed direction, not toward the drain, toward the wall. No one noticed. The engineers focused on the pressure gauge mounted on the pipe. It was in the red. One of them tapped it. It didn't budge. "It's the melt," he whispered. "The ice is shifting." Before he could finish, the ground vibrated. A low, deep rumble. Lights flickered. Then a crack rippled across the concrete wall like lightning. "Move!" someone shouted. They ran. Behind them, the pipes snapped open with a metallic roar. Steam and supercooled gas blasted into the corridor. The shockwave echoed through the base. Above ground, no one would have heard it beneath the howling Siberian wind. Inside the base, it reverberated like thunder in a tomb. Back in operations, alarms finally screamed to life. Emergency red lights spun overhead. System failures cascaded across the control panels, coolant failures, structural shifts, communications blackouts. Orlov stared at the data in disbelief. "This isn't seismic activity," he whispered. "This is collapse." Rostov clenched his jaw. "Seal the unstable tunnels," he ordered. "Get the teams out." But it was too late for some. A collapsible access corridor in sublevel 5 gave way, crushing 2 engineers beneath tons of rock and metal. Another chamber bowed inward as the permafrost melted behind its walls, pushing them like hands pressing against glass. Pipes ruptured throughout the complex. Steam filled the lower passages. Electrical fires sparked in isolated sections. Yelena tried repeatedly to contact the surface station. Nothing. The base was turning into a steel grave. And then something even stranger happened. On the central monitor, one that tracked atmospheric pressure inside the restricted sectors, a new warning flashed. Sector R12, unauthorized pressure rise. Manual override. Required. Rostov stared at it. R12 was the deepest, most classified section of the entire facility. Even he didn't have full clearance. Only 2 officers did. And both were currently trapped behind a collapsed tunnel. "What's stored in R12?" Yelena asked, voice trembling. Rostov didn't answer. He knew exactly what was stored there. The Soviet Union had built many secret projects during the Cold War. Early warning systems, biocontainment labs, experimental reactors. But R12 housed something different. Something designed not just to detect threats, but to counter them preemptively. Something they were never able to stabilize properly. If the pressure was rising in that chamber, the disaster wasn't just structural. It might become political or global. "Get me the master keys," Rostov ordered. "We're going down there." Yelena stepped in his path. "Sir, if R12 goes unstable, we may not come back." Rostov tightened his coat and said only one thing. "Then we don't let it go unstable." He motioned for 2 soldiers to follow. They grabbed lanterns, oxygen masks, and emergency gear. The base shook again, dust drifting from the ceiling like falling ash. As they descended into the lower levels, the lights dimmed until only the lantern glow illuminated their steps. Pipes hissed around them. The floor vibrated beneath their boots. The deeper they went, the warmer the air became. Almost tropical. It didn't make sense. This was Siberia. Permafrost country. Something unnatural was happening in R12. When they reached the reinforced door, Rostov noticed something chilling. The ice that normally coated it was gone. The steel dripped with condensation. Heat radiated from the seams. He inserted the master key. The door clanked, but then it resisted. Something heavy on the other side was pressing outward, bulging the metal slightly. Yelena stepped back. "Sir, something inside is trying to force its way out." Before anyone could react, a deafening metallic groan filled the corridor. The entire frame shuddered. A small jet of hot air sprayed from a microscopic crack near the hinge. The pressure was building. If the door failed, whatever they had buried in R12, whatever they were trying to contain, would be unleashed into the base. Rostov shouted for the soldiers to brace the door. Too late. The crack widened. Metal creaked. A blinding red light began pulsing from inside the chamber. They had only seconds. And somewhere behind them, deep in the tunnels they had just passed, another section of the base collapsed with a roar that shook the floors. The sound rolled through the corridor like a monster awakening. Rostov gripped the handle, and then the reinforced door jolted violently outward. A hot gust of air blasted across their faces, and through the widening crack. Something moved in the red-lit darkness, something they were never meant to see. The corridor lights flickered. The base groaned. Yelena whispered, terrified, "Sir, what is that?" Rostov didn't answer. He couldn't, because even he didn't know. The door bulged again, harder, until the hinges screeched. The red glow intensified. And then, from inside R12, something slammed into the door with a force that shook the entire corridor. If the Soviets sealed something this dangerous in the deepest chamber of a failing Siberian base, how close did the world come to discovering a Cold War threat that should never have existed in the first place? If a secret dies in silence, does it stay buried forever? Or does it wait for the perfect moment to return? The reinforced door of R12 groaned like an animal in pain. The hinges, massive steel anchors drilled into Soviet concrete, shuddered under the strain. Captain Rostov felt the heat radiating from the widening crack. Hot, metallic, unnatural. The soldiers bracing the door leaned their full weight against it, boots skidding on the wet floor. Inside the chamber, something thrashed again. A deep, concussive thud vibrated across the corridor, rattling every pipe and bolt in the walls. Yelena forced herself forward, shielding her eyes from the pulsing red glow leaking through the gap. "Pressure's critical," she whispered. "If the door fails—" Rostov cut her off. It won't fail. But he didn't believe that. He'd served long enough to know when a situation had passed the limits of discipline and training. The sounds from behind the door weren't mechanical. They weren't structural collapses or coolant explosions. This was motion, direct, violent motion. Something inside R12 wasn't dormant anymore. The base trembled again, as another tunnel collapsed somewhere far behind them. Loose dust drifted from the ceiling, coating their coats and hair like pale ash. A red emergency light flickered overhead, the dying heartbeat of a base suffocating under its own secrets. "Help me seal the secondary bolts," Rostov barked. But when he reached for the locking mechanism, the metal burned his hand. He pulled back with a gasp. The door was heating, not from outside, from within. Yelena swallowed hard. "Sir, nothing we keep in this base can produce that much heat, not without ignition." "Then something's gone active," he said. But R-12 wasn't a reactor. Rostov raised a hand sharply. Even now, even at the edge of catastrophe, some truths were too classified to speak aloud. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, their breathing shallow behind their masks. Then the screaming began. Not from the soldiers, not from Rostov, from the steel. The door's central plate began to deform, bending outward like soft clay. A long, jagged split formed at the top, glowing from the heat. A jet of superheated air blasted out, slamming the soldiers backward. One struck the wall and collapsed, dazed but alive. The second tried to get up, only for the entire base to lurch sideways. A full structural shift, a sign that the permafrost stabilizers had completely failed. Rostov grabbed Yelena's arm. Fall back, now. What about R-12? Move! They sprinted down the corridor as the massive door behind them finally buckled, with a sound that didn't belong in any Cold War facility. A deep, metallic roar, as if something ancient and buried had finally been unchained. A surge of blinding red light erupted from the chamber. Something heavy slammed into the freed door, sending it skidding across the floor like a discarded toy. The heat wave hit them seconds later, suffocating, burning the air around them. They kept running. Pipes overhead burst as they passed. Coolant sprayed across the hall, freezing mist clashing with the boiling air now filling the tunnels. The conflicting temperatures created clouds of steam that swallowed the lantern light, leaving only silhouettes running through a war zone of collapsing steel. Somewhere behind them, something emitted a sound, a rhythmic, pulsing hum. Low at first, then louder, then rising into a steady, unnatural vibration that rattled every bone in their bodies. Yelena gasped. That frequency, it matches the early warning prototypes. Rostov didn't want to hear it. He didn't want any of it to be true. The prototype inside R-12 had been built as an experimental sensor array, one meant to detect incoming threats at ranges previously thought impossible. But there were rumors whispered about it in the late years of the Soviet Union, that it had side effects, that the system could create resonances, manipulate signal waves, and interfere with structural environments. If the system had activated, alone, unsupervised, amid a failing base, it could destabilize everything. They turned a corner just as another blast door sealed behind them, triggered automatically by the spreading pressure wave. The entire base was shutting itself down, compartment by compartment. Lockdown, containment, desperation. They stumbled into operations, gasping for breath. Smoke hung in the air. Panels sparked. Maps burned on the walls. Orlov staggered out from behind a console, coughing. "Sir, what happened in R-12? The lights went out. Total darkness swallowed the room. Then, slowly, a deep red glow filled the chamber. Not from emergency lights, from the hallway. Rostov's chest tightened. The vibration was louder now, the pulsing steady and alive. "Out," he said. "We need to reach the surface. We can't contain this anymore." Orlov nodded and limped toward the exit. Yelena grabbed an emergency lantern and followed. Rostov led them through the corridor as the base behind them cracked, groaned, and failed section by section. Walls bowed inward, ceilings split. Alarms died mid-siren. The red glow behind them brightened. The hum shifted pitch. The base was unraveling. As they reached the main ascent tunnel, the long, slanted corridor leading toward the outer blast doors, they heard a final, earth-shaking roar from the depths. A shockwave tore through the tunnels. Rostov turned, shielding his face from the wall of steam and debris blasting toward them. Orlov stumbled, nearly falling. Yelena grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. They ran. With every step, The hum behind them grew louder and deeper, as if the entire Siberian underground was vibrating in response to a single, rising frequency. The base wasn't collapsing anymore. It was resonating. They reached the final stairway. Rostov slammed his fist against the manual override. The blast door hissed, groaned, then slowly rolled upward. Cold night air rushed in, freezing, sharp, clean. They sprinted out onto the snow. Behind them, the base shuddered violently beneath the ice. A plume of red-tinged steam shot from the tunnel entrance. Then another. The ground rumbled. Yelena's breath formed clouds in the bitter air as she stared at the heaving snowfield. "Sir," she whispered, "something is still happening down there." Rostov didn't respond. They all watched in silence as the snow above the base bulged, then cracked, then rose, as if something beneath were pushing upward. Flashes of red light burst through the widening fissures. The hum became a roar. The final structural failure was seconds away. Rostov turned to his team. "Run!" They staggered across the ice as the ground behind them split open with a thunderous boom. A geyser of steam erupted into the night sky, glowing red from the violent pulses below. The ice sheet buckled, sending waves of fractured snow rolling outward. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the roaring stopped. The hum fell silent. The ground settled. The red glow faded. The Siberian night reclaimed its stillness. Rostov collapsed to his knees, gasping. Yelena sat beside him, shaking, staring at the collapsing ruin behind them. Orlov broke the silence first. "Sir, did we just stop something?" Rostov looked at the ruined tunnel entrance. The ice still steamed. The Toornindi cracks still glowed faintly, but the vibration, the unnatural frequency, was gone. "No," he said softly. "We didn't stop it." Yelena turned toward him, eyes wide. "Then what happened?" Rostov watched the last ember of red fade beneath the snow. "It shut itself down," he whispered. "Whatever woke up in that chamber went back to sleep." Orlov shivered. "Can it wake again?" Rostov didn't answer. A gust of wind swept across the Siberian plain, carrying the smell of burnt metal and melted ice. Behind them, the hidden Cold War base, once one of the Soviet Union's most classified installations, was now a silent, steaming graveyard. A place where secrets didn't just die. They buried themselves. And waited. The three survivors trudged across the snow, leaving the collapsing ruin behind. By morning, Soviet recovery teams would arrive. By noon, Moscow would classify the entire incident. By nightfall, every survivor would sign documents promising silence. The base would vanish from maps, from memory, from history, buried again, but not forgotten. Never forgotten. As they reached the tree line, Yelena froze. Beneath the snow behind them, deep within the earth. The faintest tremor pulsed once, just once, like a heartbeat. If the Cold War ended decades ago, then what exactly is still alive beneath the Siberian ice?